In today's video, we're going to talk about why your box joints suck, how to make them better, and identifying problems along the way to make the process easier. In this video, I'm not going to walk you through building an entire jig. There are other videos for that. I have one for that. This is going to be about identifying parts of the jig that matter, set up things that matter. We're going to cover tear out. We're going to cover why it's important that your wood is flat. We're going to cover the glue up. We're going to cover everything I could possibly think of about all the box joints I've made along the way, all the problems I've made along the way, and how I've dealt with them to try to get the best result possible. I've put in the comments thumbnails if you don't want to watch the whole video, but you have a specific problem. Hopefully it matches up to one of those thumbnails so you can skip ahead to that part and get there. Now, the first reason your box joints may suck is that you do not have wood that is milled properly. I covered this in a different video, but being flat, straight, and square is extremely important to all joinery. Now, that begins with flattening the faces. Now, I'm going to do some of these testing and show-throughs with two pieces I've milled flat and then a piece that is totally untouched from the box center, as I know a lot of people simply don't have a planer, a hand plane, or any way to get something any flatter. Now, that will mean you're going to need to be more picky when selecting your wood, as it is paramount that this board be as flat as possible because it is referenced off of a flat face, and the flat piece is referenced off of the table saw base to cut the straight line at 90 degrees to the face and the cross cut at 90 degrees to the straight line. It cannot be overstated how much of a problem it can be if your wood is not flat and it is moving around. When you go to clamp, one side's coming out, the other side's coming out, because this runs on a router table, which I use, in a straight line. Therefore, any kind of angling due to cup or twist from where you clamp it is going to add an angle to the joint. Now, I know not everyone has the tools or the money to buy the tools to get wood as flat as can be. They don't have a planer or a jointer. Just do your best. Your results will improve the closer it is to flat to begin with, but you can still get pretty good results with a Home Depot board that has not been flattened by you, but is pretty good coming out of the store. So really check that wood while you're there. The second reason your box joints may suck, and this may seem simple and obvious, but it's kind of important, is that your length, your width, and your thickness need to all be identical. For opposing sides in terms of length, obviously you can vary the length of the box, but any opposing side needs to have the same length. Your width needs to be the same, or else your finger joints will not line up and you'll have a box that rocks back and forth. And extremely importantly, your thickness needs to be the same, or else one of your sides will slide in more than the other when it comes time to clamp, and that will want to kick out another side, and you will have problems with joints opening up gaps due to that. So if possible, again, this goes along with flat and the milling process in general, but make sure you're using two pieces of identical thickness on the opposing sides, and preferably all together. But you can do it with different thicknesses as long as they're on the opposing sides so that the clamps clamp at the same depth. Now, for number 3, we're going to dive into the jig itself and all the problems that can arise when the jig is on the router table. A lot of this applies to the table saw too. I just don't happen to do it that way as I don't have a dado stack. So let's go over there and we're going to take a detailed look at all of the different things that can go wrong, whether it's constructed wrong or you're using it not to the best of its functional capabilities. So for the basics, all box joint jigs, whether table saw or router, work off of the same principle. We have a slot cut that is our router bit's thickness. We have a key that allows us to make the offset that is the same thickness there. And I have a video, and plenty of people have videos on making this, so we're not going to cover that today. But if you're starting from scratch and you haven't made one yet and you're watching this, that's essentially how it works. Cuts, holds there, and it references at exactly the thickness of your router bit as you're going every time. Now, a lot of little problems can arise along the way of making this and along the way of using it. We'll start with the most basic one here, and that is the most frustrating for a lot of people, and that is getting the box joints looser or tighter. you will make a replica of this, ideally from the same piece of wood, that will be used as a spacer. So getting this key in the correct position is very important. I used to have an adjustable one of these, but I gave it away to a friend, and I'm just back to using my old one now because I haven't taken the time to make another one. But adjustable ones are really nice in that often seasonal change can move this little bit, just a little bit, which can change how the box joints fit. So if you're struggling, if you want the box joints tighter, you need to move it that way. If you want them looser, you need to move it in this way. Make sure to keep the same key around, but also be aware that over time, the edges of this will get a little worn down, and friction in general can compress it a little bit. So you may have to play with that if you're using the same jig for years and years and years, or you may be fine. I suggest using a dense hardwood for this key, at a minimum oak. So the next basic one is that simply this needs to be fitting really nicely in your miter slot. Now there are other jigs that Rockler sells, and maybe some other do, where the whole thing is affixed in the miter slot and you push and pull this way. This one won't be, that won't be relevant to those jigs as it's not moving. But you need to have little to no wiggle in this. If this is wiggling at all, it's going to change the angle of the cut as you go through. Up next, we have the problem of dust and pitch buildup. If you use yours a lot, you'll get pitch that will build up around here, and it can offset this, even just by a little bit. So when you're going along, especially if you're batching a lot of things out, just keep an eye in this corner here that you are not offsetting your piece at all because there's dust stuck in there. These are a little hard to use dust collection on. I have mine sucking through the bottom here, but this can be quite a dusty process if you don't have a vacuum really close to it. Another thing I want to touch on in relation to building your box joint jig and stability is the size of the pin, specifically the height. Now you're going to want to base this off of the average material you're going to want to cut on here, because it needs to be shorter than whatever your bit height minimum is going to be, right? If your finger is smaller than this, you're not going to be able to set this down over it. So this is one of those where maybe you make a couple face plates, a few different ones, or you just, only cut certain size material on this. If you make a very tiny one, however, you lose some reference surface in terms of the height and whatnot. If it's real tiny, you may get some kind of wiggling back and forth. So that's a bit of a decision you have to make early on, is the height of the key, and that provides more stability or less stability. But the taller it is, the thicker a piece of material you can cut. Your bit has to be higher than this key. So I hope that makes sense, and that's just another thing for stability when going through the cut, is how much reference surface you have. After that, I want to talk a little bit about dust collection, because this is an extremely dusty process, and I personally have built something for my router table that allows me to put the vacuum pulling everything underneath an incredible suction. And actually I have to do a little more work on this. I need to put some holes in here because it's almost too much suction. But if you don't have something pulling it down, it's going to fling it out and everywhere, and some of it will go down, but it's going to be a mess. Before I built that, I used to actually have to clamp a dust hose off to the side, and I'd have to occasionally blow this area out. That's going to depend on your router table and how you want to set up your jig. I considered early on putting a hole in this and feeding a hose through, but then I realized I'd lose some reference surface here for small pieces. Just think about that as you're going along and building your jig, depending upon the router table you have. Do you have some way of removing the dust, or are you just going to have to deal with it and either clamp a hose on there or blow it away every once in a while? Up next, we have the bit selection itself. Now you can use a straight bit, spiral bit. I use an upcut spiral because it's what I keep around for doing mortises. It works great. Upcuts keep the bottom cleaner, downcuts keep the external point cleaner. I don't have a preference, but this one works fine for me. The key though is this needs to be sharp. And if you have been using the same bit for a long time and it's slowly worn away a little bit, it will change fractionally over a long time. This key may need to be remade for the bit. And conversely, if you've been using the same bit for a long time and you buy a new one, and you made the key with the kind of worn down bit, it will not fit correctly. I use Whiteside's upcut spiral. I really prefer to have quite a long cutting length on this here as well, which is why I like the spiral better, because I run this on 3/4 inch MDF, meaning that if I'm doing 3/4 inch box joints, the tip of that bit needs to make it all the way up through the table, through this, and into here too. So consider, if you're buying your first bit for this, the material you're going to use on the base, how far your router collet can come up before hitting the base, and how far up you're going to need it to go. I'll link the bit I use in the description. And the last one directly involving the jig goes back to our flat, straight, and square. And that is that if this is not, these haven't been cut to 90 degrees yet, but if this is not straight and you then do not have a 90-degree cut from your crosscut sled or miter gauge, it will not sit correctly when it comes time to reference these next to each other. You need these to close on each other in order to have the correct reference space. You also, if this is not flat and you've got a flat face here and you go to clamp this down, you see how much that wiggles? If I'm clamping or holding on this side, I prefer to clamp. Some people hold, but I like to clamp to ensure. If I clamp here, this is now sticking out at a slight angle. If I clamp here, this is. So if I'm over here, that bit is going to be, because it maintains a straight line, going in at a slight angle compared to what it should be. And this is why it's so important that your wood is flat, straight, and square to the best of your ability. This side's even worse. And we're going to use this piece to show, because it's got a nice little cup in it, which is going to leave a nice little gap. It will follow the shape of that cup, because no matter how nice your jig is, if this wood is not lining up when it's clamped properly and this is not touching, the joints are going to be bad, because the angles are going to be off from where you're cutting, as well as the positioning in reference to one another. I wanted to show you guys something interesting. I'm actually going to have to remake a new faceplate. I haven't used this in a while. It was made, I think, last winter. And I got a perfect example of when you construct things out of wood changes. It's extremely humid right now, and this was made in the dry part of winter. My key no longer really fits. It is so tight because of how humid it is that this is functionally useless for me. So I'm gonna have to make a new faceplate for this video. And I just thought that was a really cool kind of example. I mean, unfortunate, and I have to remake a faceplate, but a cool example of how humidity can change wood. This was perfectly fine and functioning and used many times last winter, but no longer does it fit. All right, I've got the new faceplate made. Ignore this lack of professionalism slightly. This was on the fly. I want to show you something that I think gets skipped over a lot, and it's what it should look like when you've got your key in there in the right pressure, because it can be too easy to shove the key in or have it too loose, and it's a very precise fit, because when we go to cut, a lot of times people get box joints that you have this little kind of overhang. You get this weird overhang, and then you have to sand it and it doesn't sit right, and that's because when you're going to cut the underside, your bit is not removing exactly that. It's either it's taking too much or too little off, and therefore offsetting this one way or the other. This key has to match this, and it has to be set so that when you cut what I call the under of the fingers on the opposing side, it removes exactly the same amount that's left here. Okay, I've got the cord unplugged here because I need to align this bit. So just know that I'm not grabbing that with this connecting. So we need the bit to be that both of our cutters are at are parallel to the face. We've got our key, and what you want is to bring this to where it will connect about here. You will have this slid off to the side, as yours won't be connected yet. And you want this to go in so that it does not turn the bit when you're going in. But we want this to be able to slide in so that we're not moving the bit and so that it's making real contact. I'm going in, I'm getting a little scraping, but I'm not turning the bit. It's just perfectly in there. That key can't move but it can still come out. And this is one of the hardest things to get right when you're dialing this in. And like I said, I just haven't gone back and made an adjustable one again yet after giving it away. So assuming you're going to do this style, this fit right here has to be precise. And erring on the side of looser or tighter, if you can't get it right, is up to you. You can always mallet something together tighter, but you can't get looser ones to glue. So if you've gone back and forth and you can't get it, it's up to you, but I generally advise to err on the tight side of slightly tighter. And if you need to adjust, you're going to move that way. You're going to move the pin away to get tighter and the pin towards to get looser. Cover that once again. If your box joints on your setup are too tight, you need to move the pin inwards toward the router bit. And it's quite possible that your key is a little bit off. And that's why, even though you've got it pressed up there correctly, it's not cutting them the way you want. And if you need them tighter, you need to move the pin away from the router bit. Now, I personally don't like having to mallet my joints together if I don't have to, but I don't want them to move. I want to have to use some force and a friction fit, but I don't want to have to mallet them together if I don't have to. Though, like I said earlier, I'd rather have to mallet them a little bit than have them too floppy, because you need that wood-on-wood surface for wood glue to work. So hopefully that helps you with setting up and the pressure you need on the key. Now, right before I cut these joints, I want to touch on one more thing, and that is the bit height. The height of the bit has to be at minimum equal to this, or else your joints will not go all the way together. Now, you have the choice of going a little over or a lot over if you're not entirely sure. What I highly suggest is we want to get a ruler, we want to place our piece up there, obviously with the power cord undone, and we want to just kind of wave it back and forth. And as soon as we touch, go back down again, and then just a little up. We just want it stopping. We don't want to be scratching too much our ruler. You just want to be able to use your finger and feel that. Your fingers are very, very sensitive. But one of the things you have to pay attention to, and this is why I mentioned a little bit over, is that if you've got a cupped piece of wood and you're clamping it on there and whatnot, when these go together, let's say there's a cup right here, the middle fingers coming in from this side, there will be a gap here because this is cupping out like that. And so the fingers coming from this way may not make it all the way through. And clamps can usually pull it together a little bit or enough if the cup isn't too bad. But if you are looking at your piece of wood and you're picking one point and you haven't, milled this nice and flat, check a couple different points on this board and set it to the highest point. Now that's going to mean a few fingers are a little over, but it means the highest point will be cleared so that when you go to clamp together, your entire finger section will be through by a little bit. Obviously factor in, if the internal size is very important, that you're going to lose whatever extra little bit you go over, as the wood will sit in that deep. I like that. I'm going to double check it on a different area. I'm happy with that too. I don't mind having to trim the fingers a little bit. I think that's better than having it too short. I usually take a chisel if I've gone too far over and then sandpaper. I'd rather have them pointing out a little bit than not meeting, because you would have to remove the entire surface of the side if they do not go all the way through, which is a lot more work than trimming back a few little points of wood. I'm only going to make one end for each of them. I'm not going to take the time to make boxes. I'm not going to show much of this either, because I don't think it matters that you're watching me pull this back and forth. So we'll skip ahead with just a little bit of footage of cutting them and then to the results. All right, we're going to do the cupped piece first, but I wanted to show you the clamping and what happens. So this one has a pretty big cup on it. I exaggerated a little bit. I like to clamp my box joints, but if I clamp on that side, you'll see this huge gap there, and it does the same vice versa. And if you clamp in the middle, neither of them are really touching. You've got a gap there and you've got a gap there, which is obviously problematic for when that's going together, but I wanted to show you the contact point issues. I want to touch on, while I'm cutting this cupped one, another issue sometimes people have, and it's aligning this next corner. Obviously, you're going to want to unplug your router for this. You're going to want to blow out and make sure this is clean. And we're using the opposing pin as our offset, right? So one thing I see people do is try to ram this thing in there, and you end up twisting this a little bit, tilting this a little bit, and then it's no longer nice and flat. You don't need to be squeezing these things together. You just want to have it so that your gap there really disappears. This one's, because of the cup, you can see this one sitting a little over top of this one due to the, or this way, the cup that way. Just put it up against there and then clamp it on. And this should be able to be removed with a little bit, but not a whole lot of movement. You can even, if you want, assuming you believe you've got this right, leave this in there for this first cut for a little extra stabilization. Now, I really like to double clamp when I'm doing the underside of this pin because this thing has no stabilization from this pin at all. And any movement is going to cause a huge problem. So I actually really like to double clamp when I'm doing the first side of the under and we have no reference on the side. All right, let's look at the cup really quick here and the problem caused. This is actually not as bad as I thought it would be. I probably should have taken a little more off to make a more severe cup. But you can see we're missing contact up here, and then it starts to contact down here. And that's because the board is angling away. And if you're putting contact here, it's not going to make it up there, and vice versa. These are obviously easy. Dust and glue will fill these. But if it's a bad cup, it's going to be, you're probably not going to have even this many contacted. So overall, not terrible. You can see we've got the gap up here because this is shut down here, and we're cupping away from that. But not as bad as I thought it would be. I should have made it an even bigger cup to really show off. But overall, you can fix this, or I should say aesthetically hide that. All right, now we're going to take a look at the twisted piece. And this one's a lot tougher. If you're starting from here, you're going to have a lot of problems. You can see that's not going to want to sit flat against there at all, which means if the clamping pressure is here, the hole is going to be going a little that way. And if it's here when it's on this way, it's going in at an odd angle. And I think one of the harder parts here is that when these try to go together, there's going to be an odd gap. And that's setting your bit height. You've obviously got a thickness of material, but if you clamp this in one area, when this goes to get clamped together, it's not exactly going to clamp the same. So I like to set a little more than a hair above what I would normally do when I'm working with something that's really twisted. There are times when I've made box joints for outdoor projects, and I'm just not going to take the time to mill up nicely some outdoor lumber. You can get it to work in the end. It's just not as pretty and not as easy to do. So if you're working with real twisted wood, just raise that bit just a little bit higher so that you got a little more chance when you're clamping these together of the fingers going through all the way. We can see in close here one of the problems. We see how this is not fully contacting unless we're pressing on the right hand side. If we press to the left, it wants to come out. So you can imagine that bit going in, and it's no longer going in straight to the edge of this board here. All right, so we've got our cut done for the twisted wood, and you can see the massive gap as this board wants to lean like that on this side and that on the other side. You can probably pull that together with clamps, but you're going to be creating so much internal stress that it is going to be trying to pull itself apart for the rest of its life, as long as it does stay together. So again, another one for why flat, straight, square wood matters. You know, we've got perfect fitting down in this area and this area. And when we turn it around, we see the opposite side of this one going this way, and we don't have the contact down here. And because this is flaying so far out, we're not even close to touching up here. I highly advise against using heavily twisted pieces of wood for box joints. Anything will help. Even if you don't have to get the thing perfectly flat, just a few swipes with the hand plane on the high spots are going to make this 60% better. Yeah, this is a really bad idea. Don't make box joints with twisted wood. All right, we're now going to run through with the flat piece of wood. You can tell a piece of wood's flat if you don't hear a clack when they come together. there's almost this air gap that slowly seals it down. So I just always find that interesting. If you've got two pieces and you want to double check to make sure they're real flat, just drop them on each other. And here were the properly milled pieces of wood. They were a little cupped after it went to about 92 degrees and 100% humidity today, but really impressed with how this turned out. We've got the tiniest, maybe thousandth of an inch gap here. These are flush up here, and there's really no gaps whatsoever. So you can see the significant difference in using flat wood when you're doing box joints, and then also all of the other things I've pointed out along the way. And we will go over a few more things now, troubleshooting tips and whatnot. Here we can get a look at all three of them together. The cup on the right, the twist on the left, and the flat and straight in the middle. Again, these all had straight edges put on them, and they were all cut to 90 degrees. It's simply that when you're milling something and when you're using it on a reference surface and it's not flat, you're going to end up with problems. Major problems in some cases, and you're going to end up with almost no problems if it is flat. All other factors being equal, assuming your setup of your jig is right and whatnot. But the wood really matters. It doesn't have to be expensive, nice wood. This is Home Depot common board. It just needs to be as flat as you can get it. You don't need to spend 10 grand to go buy fancy planers and jointers, but over time, if you do invest in your shop, consider a planer, consider a hand plane, something like that, and just improve along the way. Work on picking out the best boards available when you're at the store. Sometimes you can find some pretty nice ones there and not have to do anything on your own, things like that. The next thing I want to talk about is tear out, and this can be a real big problem with box joints. And there are a few things we can do to minimize this. The number one is a fresh router bit, a sharp router bit. If you're planning to do a lot of box joints, I'd have a separate router bit just for that. It should be a spiral bit. That really is going to improve your chances. The difference in upcut versus downcut spiral is that upcut spirals leave the bottom cleaner, so I guess the top in this case, if we're looking up, downcut leaves the outside a little cleaner. I don't know, I use an upcut. I can't really tell you if there's a big difference there because the tear out we're worried about is mostly on the back here blowing out as we go through. You can experiment with either. I've always used an upcut spiral. It works fine. I do have to deal with tear out though, and so there's a few other things. Now the main problem of our tear out is going to come due to this cutter hole here and how close to zero clearance that is. If you have had to shift this back and forth a couple times to get the fit right, this is now suddenly going to be wider than the bit itself, leaving you with some unreinforced areas on the side when the bit goes through, and that's going to want to yank the fibers. We have a few other things. The first is scoring along here, and this is a bit of a mixed bag. For doing this, you can either use a marking gauge or whatever version of marking knife you use, and you'll need to place it right along the height of the bit. And the only downside is you either have to be very careful and only cut where the router is going to be coming through, or you're going to have a cut line even across the fingers that are still there, and so you're going to either have to do some sanding or some hand planing to remove that. I know some people kind of leave that because it looks, it's a real handmade sign, right? That you've got some kind of tool marks on there. I don't like it. I've used it a couple times. It's very effective. I mainly just use it on the back side, but once in a blue moon, I've gotten some tear out on the front. So if you want to do both sides to be safe, you can do that. I consider that more of the nuclear option. And the main thing I do, and I don't do this always, but quite a bit unless the bit's really fresh, is I just put blue tape on the back of it all. I don't usually do it on the front, but I usually put it on the back. And one thing you need to remember is you should also put some up here so that your piece isn't canted forward at all. Put a little bit, matching amount up top there for when it goes on the reference surface. And there are a few downsides to this. The first is that it can gunk up your router bit a little bit, so downside there. The second is that it doesn't necessarily pull the tape out, so you'll get these little kind of flaps of tape, and if you're not careful, they can then push your workpiece out a little farther. This is one of those where it certainly adds some work, and zero clearance is preferable because I've had times even where I have to, after each one of them, pull off the little piece of tape. And as you can imagine, that gets very time consuming. But this is going to be your cheapest go-to if you either don't have one of these or you don't want to put or risk any tool marks on there. It's pretty effective, it's just time consuming. The next one is going to be the speed that you go through the bit at. I like to try to do a steady speed all the way through. This can be a little hard to get right. I pull based purely on where my router table is. I know a lot of people push the jig through, and on the table saw, you're always going to be pushing it through. I pull, I don't know if it matters. I feel like I get a little more control pulling backwards than if I was to be pushing forward. But the speed is more important. You don't want to be flying through that thing unless you just aren't particularly concerned about the tear out on the back. Let the bit remove it and just let your arms kind of pull through while the bit is removing the wood. If you go really fast, you're almost certainly going to get some tear out. And then lastly, certain types of wood are just very tear out prone, right? Cherry, torrefied maple, which I've found out recently. And if you've got certain woods, you're going to probably have little to no problem. And if you've got other ones, you're almost certainly going to have some of these methods employed to really make sure. Because if you get some bad tear out, I don't want to say it's game over. Enough sanding and planing can get rid of it, but it can be a real problem and you may have to remove a lot of material. Sometimes you'll also occasionally get tear out on the side of the fingers, and that's nearly impossible to fix because you can't add that material back in there. You can usually fix when it's on the top of the cuts. When it's on the side, real problematic. But any of these methods, if you're having problems, will be helpful. But if you can get a new bit, definitely go with the new bit. If it can be a spiral bit, definitely go with a spiral bit. The next thing we need to cover is the glue up, because this can either be really simple or it can cause you serious problems. And one of the issues is the protruding fingers. Even if they're just protruding a little bit, if you put the clamp directly on the protruding fingers, it's not going to be able to pull the outer board in all the way. It's going to be stuck on the width of this side piece. So I like to set my clamps just slightly inside of these. There are things you can buy that are box joint clamps that have alternating pressure points, essentially. I haven't invested in those. I just set my clamps right in this area. However, you have to be careful not to set it too far. Let's say you've got a big wide one like this. If you put a clamp in the middle here and the wood is not particularly thick or not particularly hard, you can bow this in and it will then be glued like that. I'm hoping you can see this, but this is just a 1/4 inch little plywood storage thing I made. But this is bowed in from the middle because I put the clamps in the wrong spot. I should have had them over here on the ends, but I put them in the middle. Maybe I was out of clamps and using them for something else. I don't know why. It was a dumb decision, but this is never going to pop back out because it has now been glued at this slight little angle, and the fingers have been bent a little bit and are now rock solid due to the glue. Another thing in regards to clamping is, depending upon the height, I like to have a clamp both bottom and top. You can try to put one in the middle. It probably works out, especially if you've got your joints really perfect here and everything was flat. But just out of precaution, I like to put one on the bottom and on the top. And like I said, I don't stick them over the fingers. If the fingers are protruding at all, it will not bring this board all the way in. You want to just be right in there. I just think that ensures you get full clamping contact everywhere. A lot of clamps have a pressure point. They're not necessarily directly in the center. And so putting one on the bottom and top ensures that both are pulled in together. Now there are a couple schools of thought of how to glue box joints. The first is that you apply glue on every single pin of both sides. I call them pins, the fingers of both sides. The second is that you only apply to one and then you push the mating one in and they're contacted. And the third is that if they're very, very tight, you can use some kind of wicking glue, a CA glue that wicks in. I've seen some people do that before with box joints. If they're really confident that they're extremely tight and well fitting, they just wick the glue in. I personally only put glue on one side, and I put it top and bottom of any finger that's going to be coming into contact. I use a small little pick to do this. So this allows me to just put a little pool of glue, pick it up, spread it on each of them. And one of the problems with this, and especially if you're trying to do to each of them, is it's time consuming. And I use type on 3, which gives me about 10 minutes of work time. By the time you're on all of these, you're getting real close to it being super tacky. And if these are really nice and tight fitting and you've now got glue in there and they're super tacky, I've had times where I just could not pull them all the way together. It was just too sticky, too tacky. And so that's what led me to move to just doing only one side of each corner. I feel that I still get enough glue on there, everything is still contacting, and it allows it to take about half the time. So consider that. I know some people are just, I want to slop the glue on everywhere, and that's totally fine, but you got to be a little strategic. I have occasionally seen, though I don't think this is particularly a good idea, some people line them up. They don't bend them together. They line up all the pieces, set them down like this, squirt glue here, kind of just blow it or push it in there, and then turn it up and squeeze it all together. Now, one of the problems with this is that this really easily will get glue on the inside here. I hate having to clean up glue from the inside. I like to oil the inside of my boxes, and if there's any blocked fibers due to glue, I'm not going to be able to get that oil there, and it's very noticeable. Now, a lot of times people will put blue tape on the inside of the box. That's fine, you can go ahead and do that. That's just a step I often don't take. I just try to get my glue amount right, and you don't need a lot. You just need to have it spread on both the surfaces on all areas of it. You should get some squeeze out on the outside, but if you've done it right, you shouldn't get any squeeze out really on the inside. If you want to go for it and clean up the squeeze out with some kind of chisel or pick or a straw, that's fine. I just like to not have to take that step. Up next in terms of troubleshooting and process is trimming the fingers or flattening the whole face. Now, if you set the bit height correctly, there really shouldn't be a whole lot, just a hair or two above, and just a little bit of sandpaper should remove those. However, if you've set it too high, you have a few options. The first is a flush trim saw, though sometimes it's almost too low for a flush trim saw, but high enough that it's going to take you a while with sanding. In that case, I personally like to use a chisel. However, do not chisel from the inside out. It's very easy to blow out this corner here. Come from the inside in and then just slowly remove the last little bit, or even leave the last little bit on the edge and then take sandpaper to that after you've removed the inside. It's a delicate process, but it can work if your finger is a little too high for sanding and a little too low for this to really grab on. I like to, if I'm using this flush trim saw, come from the side and have my cut finishing in, because if these are glued correctly, this face is now a back surface to these fingers and you won't get any tear out. If you go from the inside out, there's a possibility you will get some chipping out if this isn't super sharp or if this isn't super sharp. So be careful with that. I highly advise against using a random orbit sander, unless you have one thing, and that is a hard pad. I do not. These are soft. And the problem with that is, especially if the box is smaller in width than this or really close to this in width, it will round this over, especially if you have to do a lot of finger removal. I only bring this in when I'm doing my last grit, and it's just a quick pass over it. This will round this over really fast if you're on a low grit. 120, 150, that kind of thing. You have to be super careful unless you buy a hard pad bottom, which they do sell. I think you can get them on Amazon. So just be very careful in your selection here. Ideally, it's just a little hand sandpaper. I also glue sandpaper to blocks so that I can get a full reference on there and that I know that I'm not going over this way. I'm just going straight out. I like this a lot. Ideally, you only have to do a little bit with this, and then you can sand the face with these blocks. I really take pride in my boxes being sharp on the corners, flat, straight, all of that. I think that really improves the look at the end of it all. Now, the final thing in the aesthetic troubleshooting thing is dealing with the gaps. Now, hopefully you have no gaps, or there's only a few and they're very tiny. And I don't like to make the putty and shove it in there. I like to put glue in, then layer some dust over the top, press it in, and then if it sinks a little bit, I come back later. I've never had a problem with doing that. It doesn't come out. I find that if you make the putty, you can sometimes get a really dark area here, or even get the glue into the end grain. I like to come in, put a little on a surface, and just use my pick or a small nail and just put it on the edge. And the one thing I highly suggest is you push it away when you're going to push that glue in there. Don't bring it onto the end grain. It can get in those pores, and finishes, if you're using an oil, will struggle to get in there. Put it on there very delicately. I like to push it away, and then I like to take my sawdust, put some on there, and then I like to take a 200 grit piece of sandpaper and quickly go over it. And I find that that is the best way to get a matching color as close as possible. A lot of times it's just a little bit darker if you're using an oil finish, and it's usually not noticeable, especially if the gap isn't too big. So I actually like to collect sawdust. I think that's some Bolivian rosewood from a long time ago, but I like to keep it around so that in case I don't have any from this, whatever particular piece, I can check the color. Does it match pretty well? Okay, I go in and do that. And that's going to do it for us today. Hopefully, after you've watched this, if your box joints were struggling before, you've now identified where the problem is and how to make it better. I know not everybody owns a planer or a jointer and a planer, but just working towards the flattest wood possible is going to make everything in the process much better. It's going to minimize your gaps. If you have any questions, comments, if I left something out, a trick that you know to make box joints even better, please put it in the comments so that everyone can learn. I'd love to learn more. I'm always looking for ways to perfect my woodworking, and we're all on this journey together. Thank you. Have a good one.